My name is Roberta, and I'm going to be giving the talk this evening. Now, with that being said, today when we discuss our royal governors of Massachusetts, we do tend to talk about them in a very general group sense. We don't really talk about who the men behind the title were. And when we do talk about them, we also talk about them in a very demonic and vilified light. And we don't really question whether or not they deserve that reputation. So part of my goal today is just to introduce you to some of those royal governors here in Massachusetts leading up to the American Revolution. But before I do that, I do just want to offer a definition of what a royal governor really was. So back in the 1700s, the colonists had a king who was all the way back home in Great Britain. He was 2 months away by sea with quite a lot of things on his mind. The last thing that king really wanted to worry about was the day-to-day dealing of each of his 13 colonies. So he or the British ministry would appoint a royal governor to each of the colonies here in North America that had a royal charter. And those royal governors, once here, would act as a representative of the king and parliament in that colony they were appointed to. They also were the ones, more or less, just making sure that everything went according to British law in the colony. Now, a royal governor didn't act in much of a different capacity as, say, one of our state governors today, but there are a couple major differences in that today, when we have a state governor, that state governor is usually elected by the people from amongst the people on a 4-year term basis. The royal governors, on the other hand, were not chosen from amongst the people or by the people. They were chosen by the British ministry back home in Great Britain, and they were here pretty indefinitely. So either until they resigned from office, died in office, or were recalled from office. So that's really the major difference between something like a royal governor today, or a royal governor back then, versus a state governor today. Now, the 3 royal governors I would really like to introduce you to today include our last 3 civilian royal governors leading to the American Revolution, and this includes Thomas Pownall, Francis Bernard, and Thomas Hutchinson. And I do like to start with Thomas Pownall, who you can see in this portrait right here. And I like to start with Thomas Pownall because he is arguably one of the most popular royal governors that Massachusetts had. He actually doesn't start that way, though, because in 1757, when he became our governor, he arrived under some very unique circumstances. Massachusetts and the other colonies, as well as Great Britain, was in the midst of a major war effort, which we call today the French and Indian or 7 Years' War. But in addition to this, Thomas Pownall, when he became governor, actually had been instrumental in orchestrating the removal of our previous governor before him, a man by the name of William Shirley. And there's William Shirley right above here. Now, William Shirley actually also was a very popular governor here in Massachusetts, and he actually was responsible for making Massachusetts the leading colony in New England to put help and support into the French and Indian War effort for Great Britain here in the colonies. So the people of Massachusetts really liked William Shirley, and to have this new incoming royal governor who comes in, who helped orchestrate his removal, did kind of set the stage for Thomas Pownall to show up to a lot of caution as far as whether or not people were going to like his administration. But that being said, another thing that stood in Thomas Pownall's way was the fact that the way our royal governorship worked is if we didn't have a royal governor physically in the colony, usually a lieutenant governor would act in his place. But if we also didn't have a lieutenant governor in the colony, then our Massachusetts Massachusetts Council, this is the upper house of our legislative branch of the colonial government, would actually absorb the powers of both the executive branch and legislative branch into each other and start acting as both legislative branch and executive branch combined. So Thomas Pownall actually arrived under one of those rare circumstances where our legislative branch had that taste of what it was like to run the government as both the executive branch and the legislative branch, and they really did not want to give the royal governor his full powers back. So this left Thomas Pownall actually working with what he felt was a hostile legislative branch. And the problem with this is he was actually trying to field a lot of pressure from his superiors back home in England, but also from the field of battle here in the colonies in the French and Indian War, of requests for more support and men from Massachusetts in that French and Indian War effort. And every time Thomas Pownall approached his legislative branch, the legislative branch would argue to him that they had put enough men and enough effort into the war effort, that they were exhausted financially, and they couldn't do anything else. So Thomas Pownall would spend his first year in office in 1757 writing back and forth to his superiors, writing that he was suffering from nervous headaches from all of this pressure. This pressure actually relieves itself a year later in 1758, when the British ministry actually promises our legislative branch compensation for all expenses paid during the French and Indian War effort. And once that is promised to our legislative branch, they completely open up, voting on the sending of 7,000 more men into the French and Indian War effort. This decision was so exciting to Thomas Pownall that he actually told his legislative branch that he would lead the men of Massachusetts into battle himself. This might seem like a far-fetched idea coming from a royal governor, but Thomas Pownall, before he became governor, was an adventurer and an explorer in the western frontiers of the colonies and in the colonies themselves. So he was used to looking towards that next adventure ahead of him. He was not used to sitting in the same place for a long extended period of time. So for him, the suggestion to go out into battle with the men was just part of that natural part of his personality, to look towards that next adventure ahead of him. In addition to this, Thomas Pownall's predecessor, William Shirley, who we spoke about earlier, had actually also been the commander-in-chief of British forces here in North America for a time. And so there had been a precedent of a royal governor, and not only just a royal governor, but one from Massachusetts, leading British forces and leading a campaign effort. So to Thomas Pownall, this really didn't seem like a far-fetched idea. But as you probably can imagine how his superiors back home in England felt, they felt that Thomas Pownall should be staying here in Boston, working more with the logistics of how to send supplies and effort out into that French and Indian War effort itself, instead of fighting in the battles. So much to Thomas Pownall's chagrin, he did have to stay here in Boston, but it was that show of willingness to get out into the battles with the men that did gain Thomas Pownall a lot of respect. He actually gains a lot of respect in other areas as well, because he was a royal governor that at the end of the day was willing to come down from the governor's chair. He would go to the taverns, he would socialize and drink with the people. He even sometimes would disguise himself and go into the western frontiers of the colony on mini vacations, where he would stay over a settler's house. And during his time there, he would speak to those settlers, and eventually, at one point, the topic of politics would come up, which would allow him to gain valuable feedback about himself and his administration, which he could then bring back with him to Boston to help improve himself and that administration. So Thomas Pownall gains a lot of respect in all of those areas. And when he leaves as our governor in 1760, he actually leaves with a lot of pomp and ceremony. And as he was boarding the vessel back home to England, he makes a promise to the people of Massachusetts that no matter how far away he is, he will always serve the colony of Massachusetts. And this is a promise that Thomas Pownall actually does, in fact, keep. Because 7 years later, in 1767, when the colonies start seeing all of the massive upheaval and riots that we associate with the lead up to the American Revolution today over the taxes here in the colonies, Thomas Pownall at the time was actually in the House of Commons in Parliament. And when he heard of how upset the colonists were over these new taxes from Parliament, he actually made an argument to Parliament that Parliament should either repeal the taxes that were so upsetting the colonists, or they should allow the colonists to have the representation they so desired. He also argued that perhaps the colonial administration here should be completely changed to give the royal government more power here in the colonies before taxing the colonists. And finally, his last argument was perhaps Parliament should just peacefully allow the North American colonies to have their independence peacefully before they lost a chance to create treaties and economic trade with the colonists themselves. Now, as you probably can imagine, this was not a popular argument to be making to Parliament at the time. In fact, during one of his speeches, many members of Parliament got up and actually stomped out of his speech, and one, upon leaving, even murmured that they were going to allow the silly fat man have his rant. So Parliament did become rather mean towards Thomas Pownall because of these arguments. But here in the colonies, when the colonists heard of these arguments, they really viewed Thomas Pownall as a role model governor. He really had become one of the leading advocates for the American colonists in Parliament. And this sets the stage for someone who really becomes a tough act to follow, because the next two incoming royal governors who have to enforce those new unpopular taxes find it hard to fill the shoes that Thomas Pownall has now effectively left behind. Now, after the French and Indian War in 1764, Great Britain finds itself in a massive amount of debt. And as we all know how governments tend to work today, when a government is in a lot of debt, what's one of the very first things a government will do to its people today? Tax. Absolutely, they raise the taxes. Great Britain was not much different. One of the first things we start to see is actually a renewal of an act that actually was already on the books but wasn't enforced. This is the Revenue Act. And this act was a tax on your sugar and molasses. Now, the original Revenue Act actually had a price of 6p tax, but again, it wasn't enforced. The new Revenue Act lowered the tax to 3p, but British Parliament really wanted this time to make sure they enforced the tax. And the colonists felt they would much rather have a tax on the books that was unenforced, even if it was higher, than having a tax on the books that was lower and actually enforced. Another act that comes in, and this is really the act that really gets the colonists upset, this is called the Stamp Act, and this was a tax on all your paper goods, from legal documents down to playing cards. And when I say playing cards, I do mean every card in a 52-card playing deck was accounted for in that tax. Now, I've read the Stamp Act. It is a very boring read. You're more than welcome to check it out if you'd like. You can find it online today, but it is a very broad, very draconian tax. And it's also one of the first internal taxes that Parliament really starts to try, at least, to levy on the colonists, which is why it sparks such a difference in attitude toward this particular tax. Now, we also see other acts that come in. For example, we have the Townshend Acts of 1767. This is a tax on multiple imported goods from Great Britain. This is your lead, paint, tea, coffee, glass, fabrics, pretty much a good chunk of things that the colonists were importing from Great Britain. So really with this tax, it's almost like going from not being taxed on anything to being taxed on everything overnight. And that's pretty upsetting too. And later we also see the Tea Act of 1773, which was an attempt to save the East India Company from failing and from bankruptcy. They actually were hoping to create a monopoly on tea and to undersell smugglers here in the colonies. Unfortunately, when you have a lot of Boston merchants who happen to be smugglers, this is probably not the smartest idea. So you do see a lot of resentment and you do see a lot of pushback towards these taxes. Now, the first royal governor that has to enforce these taxes is a man by the name of Francis Bernard. And when Francis Bernard first arrives in Massachusetts in 1760 after Thomas Pownall, he finds Massachusetts in perfect harmony. And it does actually stay in perfect harmony for the first few years of his administration, or at least as long as the French and Indian War is still going. However, after the French and Indian War, when these new taxes start to come into play, that harmony starts to decline rather quickly. Now, Francis Bernard probably didn't help his own reputation, just because when he accepted the governorship of Massachusetts, he accepted the governorship in the hopes of supporting a rather large family of 10 children at home. And he found very quickly that the royal governorship's salary here in Massachusetts still did not pay enough to support his family. So he found himself really struggling. This meant that Francis Bernard had a little bit of an additional incentive to enforcing the new acts and taxes here in Massachusetts. As royal governor, he actually stood to gain a third of all profits of any seizures here in the colonies by the customs officials. So he started to drive towards those seizures in the hopes of gaining further income to support his family. And this actually gets him a reputation for being a kind of needy governor. So this really upsets the colonists, but there is one instance that especially upsets both the populace and customs officials alike, where Francis Bernard, in a rushed attempt to catch a vessel that was bearing false clearance papers from the Caribbean, came to Massachusetts. He actually, in a rushed attempt to catch that vessel, actually made a deal with the ship's captain that if he was paid a certain amount, he would give the ship's captain his vessels back. Now, the customs officials hated this because to them, this meant that Francis Bernard was weakening their position and was a sign of avarice to them. To the colonists, of course, they didn't like this because, again, it was a sign of things to come with his pushing for these seizures that over these new acts that they really were not looking forward to. Now, what Francis Bernard did here, though, actually was not illegal. It just was frowned upon by the people and the customs officials, and it was actually completely legal in his position as governor. But again, it really set the stage for people to really dislike what was starting to come forward here. Now, in addition to this, Francis Bernard's biggest folly was probably his decision for the Chief Justiceship of the Massachusetts Superior Court in 1760. When he first arrived here in Massachusetts, he found Massachusetts to be a very factious colony. It actually was a colony that was unique in that we did have political feuding lines that were based off of a history with our charter. And Francis Bernard saw these political parties, and he actually really wanted to abolish the parties because he saw them hindering the government. So he wanted to try to abolish them to help with the limitations that the government currently had under those political parties. These political parties, however, had been long established due to the change in our charter between the 1620s and 1690s. In the 1620s, originally, we had a charter here in Massachusetts that allowed us to annually elect our own governors. It was a very self-sufficient, independent government, and the people enjoyed that self-sufficiency. In the 1680s, however, this charter was actually revoked, and in 1691, 1692, we got a new charter. This charter called for the royally appointed governors, and this was actually England's way of trying to get a better handle on what Massachusetts was doing. Basically, it was England's way of saying, hey, you can't be completely independent from us. We have to have a hand in the government in some way. So that's when Massachusetts gets our royally appointed governors, is in 1692. Now, one political party here in Massachusetts came from this idea of wanting to go back to the original charter of the 1620s. This party is called the Country or Popular Party, and they just want to go back to self-sufficiency and that independency from the royal government. This party is the party that will later evolve into what we know today here in Massachusetts as our Patriot Party. The other side, however, may not necessarily have liked the new charter of 1692, but they at least recognized its legitimacy. This party is known as the Court Party, and they're the ones that will later evolve into the party we know of today as our Loyalist Party. Now, between those two parties, there were two leading families. On one side, on the Country or Popular Party side, we have the Otis family. And on the Court or later Loyalist side, we have the Hutchinson and Oliver families. And what we can see here is when Francis Bernard actually is left with this decision who to choose to fill a position in the Massachusetts Superior Court, he actually is very well aware that on the Country Party side, There is a gentleman by the name of James Otis Sr. who has been promised by the two previous governors before him, both William Shirley and Thomas Pownall, a position on the Massachusetts Superior Court once it becomes available. So Francis Bernard is well aware that he's expectant of this appointment, if not to the Chief Justiceship itself, at least to a position in the Massachusetts Superior Court. However, Francis Bernard was worried at the time, since he was worried about strengthening his governorship through political alliances, with alienating his lieutenant governor, a man by the name of Thomas Hutchinson, who you can see on the right here. So Francis Bernard actually decides to appoint Thomas Hutchinson to the position of the Chief Justiceship over James Otis Sr. And part of his decision is also due to the fact that, again, Francis Bernard is looking for someone that he can count on to enforce these new acts and policies coming in from Great Britain. So he chooses Thomas Hutchinson, knowing that Thomas Hutchinson is going to be the one that later, if any problems should arise, he's the one that's going to be viewing those and judging those cases, and he knows he can count on Thomas Hutchinson to keep to the British laws. So he does choose Thomas Hutchinson over James Otis Sr., and originally the Otis family, they take out all their anger at their family rival, Thomas Hutchinson. But because Thomas Hutchinson was that leading member of the court party, many people in Massachusetts began to feel that by choosing Thomas Hutchinson, Francis Bernard was making a declaration that he was part of the court party alongside Thomas Hutchinson as well. So instead of abolishing the parties here in Massachusetts, Francis Bernard ends up branded as a member of one of those parties himself. And unfortunately, this is a branding that he's just not able to outlive. Now, the one thing I do like to say about Francis Bernard is he's really just a royal governor that has too many things on his plate. And as we all know how we are today, when we try to do too many tasks at once, we cannot do those tasks adequately enough. So this is exactly what's happening to Francis Bernard, because Francis Bernard was really concerned with supporting his family, and he had a lot on his plate with supporting those 10 children at home. And he found that the British policies coming into play and all the political upheaval here in the colony was starting to interfere with his family life. At the end of the day, all Francis Bernard really wanted to do was support his family, go home to them, read to them from the latest books from London. But unfortunately, with the political upheaval, he found not only himself to be struggling, but so was his family. For example, while here in the colony, Francis Bernard struggled as a father to a son when one of his sons arrived here in the colony and announced to his father that he neither wanted to return to school nor to have an occupation. Francis Bernard and his son, typical teenage behavior, Francis Bernard announced to his son that that could not happen, and the father and son had a huge row over this, which led to his son and actually his namesake, Frank, running away. Now, Frank was actually found because Francis Bernard employed from Philadelphia none other than Benjamin Franklin himself to find Frank. Frank was found in Alexandria, Virginia, and returned to Francis Bernard, who he sent back, and Francis Bernard sent him right back home to England, had him go back to school, and he basically did what any father does to a child. He grounded him. He told his son he was not having an allowance more than he needed to attend school studies. However, Francis Bernard unfortunately would end up having to pull his son out of school due to, we don't know what Frank did, but we do know he was about to be expelled. So instead of him being shamed, he actually pulled his son out before the expulsion could happen. Now, Francis Bernard also struggles with other members of his family as well. One of his sons actually was an importer here during the non-importation agreements in Boston in 1767. The non-importation agreements were actually a response to the Townshend Acts, the taxes on the lead, paint, tea, coffee, glass, the British goods that were coming in from Great Britain. And his son had chosen to continue importing them, regardless of many merchants in town signing an agreement not to. So his son caught a lot of flack for that, and Francis Bernard actually had to lend his son £1,000 to get him out of trouble. And in addition to this, he also suffered from the loss or death of his teenage son, Chute Bernard, while here in Boston as well. So Francis Bernard does struggle a lot with this, and he personally struggled a lot with the fact that he was dealing with all of these personal struggles and still being vilified, still being attacked in the newspapers, and still trying to figure out how to solve all the riots and upheaval here in Boston. And unfortunately, this struggle resulted in Francis Bernard writing many panicked letters to the British ministry back home in Great Britain. While Francis Bernard himself never officially asked for British troops to come here to Boston, his many panicked letters to the British ministry resulted in their arrival. And unfortunately, many of those panicked letters at one point, right before the end of his governorship, ended up being leaked. This is what we call the Bernard Letters affair. And the letters were published by the Country Party in our newspapers here in Boston. And they, unfortunately, to the Country Party, unfortunately for Francis Bernard, and fortunately to the Country Party, proved to the colonists that Francis Bernard was libeling the colony of Massachusetts and setting a bad example of them in Great Britain. And they used this as an example of why Francis Bernard should be removed from office. So in 1769, when Francis Bernard was inevitably recalled back home to Great Britain, he actually left Massachusetts with a lot of mixed feelings. He was one of the longest serving royal governors here in Massachusetts, but when he leaves, he does leave a defeated one. And when he is home in Great Britain, he actually reflected on his time here in Massachusetts, saying that he felt that the British ministry had made a martyr out of him, making him have to enforce these new unpopular taxes that nobody was on board with, and having to do so especially after coming in after a very popular role model governor. So he did feel as though the British ministry kind of pulled the rug out from under him. But in 1771, Bernard suffered a stroke that left him physically disabled. And after that, he would suffer from strokes regularly afterwards. And during one such stroke in July of 1779, his sons were holding him down in the hopes of calming him. And somewhere in the confusion, he thought he was at sea. And he told his sons not to worry, for they would safely make it out of this, but to take care how they ever got into such scrapes again. And sure enough, they never would, for later that night, Francis Bernard would die at the age of 67. Now, meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, once Governor Bernard leaves, he is replaced by a royal governor that is a little harder to get rid of, because the next incoming royal governor loved Massachusetts so much, he would write a 3-volume history on the Massachusetts Bay Colony itself. He actually was a born and raised Bostonian, a 5th-generation Bostonian, in fact, whose ancestors was very fundamental in the founding of both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And this was none other than Francis Bernard's former lieutenant governor, Thomas Hutchinson. Now, Thomas Hutchinson started his career here in Massachusetts in 1737 in the House of Representatives, but he starts devotedly serving Massachusetts in 1754 after his wife died due to complications after childbirth. This was something that so distressed Thomas Hutchinson, he would never think of marrying another woman again, throwing himself into his work serving Massachusetts as a way of trying to distract himself from that despair of having lost his wife, showing signs of what we would call today a workaholic. So Thomas Hutchinson started really devotedly serving Massachusetts at that time in 1754. And by 1769, when the governorship falls into his hands, he feels somewhat best suited to try to settle the differences between the colonists and the mother country back home in Great Britain. He, however, wasn't completely unaware of how bad that rift had already become, because in fact, Thomas Hutchinson had actually become a victim of some of the riots here in Boston during the riots over taxes. And in fact, in 1767, during the Stamp Act riots in August of 1765, Thomas Hutchinson found himself in the midst of a massive riot himself, where the colonists felt that because Thomas Hutchinson was not publicly denying support of the Stamp Acts, perhaps he had a hand in authoring those Stamp Acts himself. Now, Thomas Hutchinson, being the lieutenant governor at the time, much like Francis Bernard, actually also was considered a representative of the king in Parliament, so he actually couldn't publicly deny support of those taxes either. And so he felt he didn't have to publicly come out and say anything about whether or not he supported the Stamp Acts. But it did enrage the colonists that he did not address this issue. And in August of 1765, a very angry group of colonists went to his house and ransacked it top to bottom. You can actually see on the left-hand side here a picture of the Foster Hutchinson house before it's ransacked. And on the right-hand side, you can see a depiction of the house being ransacked during the Stamp Act riots of 1765. Now, when they ransacked his house, they ransacked it top to bottom, climbing up on top of the roof, tearing shingles off the roof itself. They actually tore family portraits out of their frames, turned furniture to kindling, even went into the garden and uprooted ancient fruit trees that had been planted by his family members before him. Now, that being said, the next morning, Thomas Hutchinson had actually only barely escaped with his family from the house when the mob came to ransack his house. And the next morning, he did actually show up to work wearing the same clothes he had been wearing the night before when his house was ransacked and when he fled. And Josiah Quincy Jr. tells us that when he came into work, he came in and delivered a speech with tears in his eyes. And at this point, I would like to read to you directly from that speech. Gentlemen, there not being a quorum of the court without me, I'm obliged to appear. Some apology is necessary for my dress. Indeed, I had no other. Destitute of everything, no other shirt, no other garment but what I have on, and not one of my whole family in better situation than myself. The distress of a whole family around me, young and tender infants hanging about me, are infinitely more insupportable than what I feel for myself, though I'm obliged to borrow part of this clothing. Sensible that I am innocent, that all the charges against me are false, I can't help feeling, and though I'm not obliged to give an answer to all the questions that may be put me by every lawless person, yet I call God to witness, and I would not for 1,000 worlds call my Maker to witness a falsehood. I say, I call my Maker to witness that I never, in New England or Old, in Great Britain or America, neither directly nor indirectly, was aiding, assisting, or supporting, in the less promoting or encouraging, what is commonly called the Stamp Act, but on the contrary, did all in my power, as much as in me lay, to prevent it. This is not declared through timidity, for I have nothing to fear. They can only take away my life, which is of but little value when deprived of all its comforts, all that was dear to me, and nothing surrounding me but the most piercing distress. I hope the eyes of the people will be opened, and they will see how easy it is for some designing wicked man to spread false reports, raise suspicions and jealousies in the minds of the populace, and enrage them against the innocent. But if guilty, this is not the way to proceed. The laws of our country are open to punish those who have offended. This is destroying all peace and order of the community, and all will feel its effects. And I hope all will see how easily the people may be deluded, inflamed, and carried away with madness against an innocent man. I pray God, give us better hearts. What is ironic about Thomas Hutchinson's house being ransacked is that at the same time that his house had been ransacked, he had actually written an essay which he had distributed among members of the British ministry. And in this essay, he had actually laid out every reason why the Stamp Act was a very bad idea. And the British ministry and Parliament was actually going over this essay, trying to determine if they should repeal the Stamp Acts due to some of these ideas that Thomas Hutchinson presented in the essay. And they actually would repeal the Stamp Acts partially due to this essay. So it is ironic to see Thomas Hutchinson here in the colonies depicted as the author or perceived author of the Stamp Acts, when in reality, he had a hand in helping the colonists get the Stamp Acts repealed for them, the Stamp Act repealed for them. Now, Thomas Hutchinson would remain our royal governor through many of the events that we tend to associate with the lead up to our American Revolution today. For example, he is the royal governor during the Boston Massacre in 1770, and he actually breaks up the Boston Massacre from the balcony of what we know today as the Old State House, but back then was called the Town House. And he also delays the trial of the soldiers long enough that their trial could actually be held without being affected by the passions of the people, by the inflamed passions of the people at the time. He also does order the soldiers that are still in Boston at the time to be removed from Boston proper into Castle William and Mary off in Castle Island. He also is here for the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And it's after the Boston Tea Party that Thomas Hutchinson finally realizes his situation in Boston has become too dangerous. It's also at this time that his initial hopes and optimism that he could settle those differences between the colonists and the mother country begin to decline. And his hopes and optimism is actually replaced by feelings of doubt and defeat. So in June of 1774, Thomas Hutchinson picks up his family and moves to Great Britain. Now, when Thomas Hutchinson moved to Great Britain, he moved there with the understanding that he was just going there to defend his position as a royal governor in the royal court and then to come home back to Massachusetts. But in 1779, our legislative branch passed a bill saying that Governor Hutchinson was never allowed to set foot on American soil ever again. This so devastated Thomas Hutchinson because Massachusetts was the colony that he had served so devotedly for 37 years. It was the land where he was born and raised, and it was the only colony or only home he had ever known until this point. Now, Thomas Hutchinson also noticed that there were drastic differences in culture between Great Britain, where he was now living, and his former home in New England, and he was becoming very homesick. In fact, he wrote in his diary that he and his family lived as best they could in the New England way. In addition to this, Thomas Hutchinson was also suffering from a lot of personal tragedy. In 1777, his youngest daughter, who was his wife's namesake, the one who was born when his wife died in 1754, she died of tuberculosis. And Thomas Hutchinson said there was nothing so distressing that had ever occurred before this, save for maybe the loss of his wife before. In addition to this, in 1780, his youngest son, Billy, also died of a similar affliction as well. And when Billy died, the servants in the house actually did not want to tell Thomas Hutchinson that his son had died right away. They wanted to wait for an opportune moment. Thomas Hutchinson, however, figured out something wasn't quite right in the house, and he rushed to his son's room. And when he burst in, he says in his diary that he looked upon the dead countenance of his son for so long that he wished he had not, and that his thoughts had turned to the darker side of things. And a few months later, Thomas Hutchinson, after all of this emotional trauma and shock, would suffer a stroke and die himself. Now, Thomas Hutchinson doesn't just die a very lonely man. He does die a very disillusioned one as well. While here in the colonies, he made an argument that he had no problem with the idea of questioning policies that came from one's government. After all, governments are run by human beings, and human beings do make mistakes. The only thing he didn't agree with the colonists was that he felt that questioning those policies should not come in the form of violent riots and through questioning the superiority of a legitimate government. He felt that questioning those policies should come through legitimate means provided by the government himself. Now, when Thomas Hutchinson made this argument, he actually thought this was a perfect compromise argument. It acknowledged to the colonists that they had every right to question these policies they didn't like, while also acknowledging to Parliament and the British government that they were the superior authority here in the colonies. Unfortunately for Thomas Hutchinson, by the time he made this argument, the British ministry had adopted a policy of, if we pretend the problem in the colonies doesn't exist, it eventually won't. So before making this argument, Thomas Hutchinson had actually written many letters to the British ministry asking them what to do, and their responses were either to ignore the letters or were extremely vague. So by the time Thomas Hutchinson made this argument, when the British ministry heard of the argument, they were very upset with him, saying that by making any argument at all, he had simply brought the problem back to the forefront of the minds of the colonists, and thereby pulling the rug out from under Thomas Hutchinson as well. Now, Thomas Hutchinson also was disillusioned due to other reasons as well. While living in England, he actually was a man ahead of his time in that throughout his life, he actually was someone who felt that on some basic level, regardless of your age, ethnicity, social status, what have you, we are all made of the same flesh and blood and therefore are all equal. And this was a basic tenet that he went through life with and that he even writes about in his history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But in England, he noticed how the British aristocracy treated their subjects, and it really upset and disillusioned Thomas Hutchinson. Because one day, while walking through the streets of London, Thomas Hutchinson witnessed a British aristocrat in his carriage run over a little boy and not even stop to see if that little boy was okay. And the treatment of the loyal subjects like that Thomas Hutchinson witnessed, did make him feel very disgusted towards how the British aristocracy was actually running things. So Thomas Hutchinson does die not just a very lonely man, but also a very disillusioned one as well. So what I would like to leave you all with today is a question. And the question I'd like to leave you with today is, do you believe the royal governors deserve the demonic titles that we give them today? Or perhaps were they victims of history being written by the winners, of propaganda coming down from their time period down through ours today? Or perhaps do they deserve those demonic titles that we give them today? So that is the question I'm going to leave all of you with. If any of you have any questions for me, though, I am more than happy to answer them for you. And I thank you all so much for coming to my talk. Thank you. Yes.
Just an observation as a John Adams historian, at the end when you talked about Thomas Hutchinson looking for an understanding of the grievances, a repudiation of the violence, it sounds very much what I read in John Adams' letters leading up to that same time period.
Yes.
It was the big difference he had with his second cousin Samuel, was he did not like the violence, which is why he wrote so many tracts that were published in pamphlet form, because he felt that it had to be beyond the violence in the streets of Boston, and it had to be about legitimate arguments of representation in government.
Absolutely. Now, Thomas Hutchinson, it's interesting because, so he actually, in his private letters, very much agrees with what the later patriots are discussing. But what we find is actually everyone here in Massachusetts technically was part of what we would call the Whig Party. It just was a matter of, so in England you had the Tories and the Whigs, but here in Massachusetts we actually all were Whigs. It just was for us a matter of where on the spectrum we fell. So here it was moderate Whigs versus you have the radical Whigs. Thomas Hutchinson would have been considered more of a radical Whig. So he, in basic theory, actually agreed with a lot of what the Patriots were arguing for. It was just the method and the length to which they were willing to go that he did not feel he could bring himself to come together with them. But if you look at a lot of their arguments and a lot of their letters, if they had sat down and actually kind of calmly thought about it, they actually were arguing for the same thing, which is very interesting. But you see that with him and John Adams, you see it even with Sam Adams, even with James Otis. And the one thing, though, about James Otis is he, unfortunately, had a tendency to one day argue one thing and then another the next day. And so it left people like Francis Bernard and Thomas Hutchinson wondering what side he was really on. Thomas Hutchinson wrote a letter to one of his friends saying that Otis would constantly claim to have buried the hatchet between the two of them. And then suddenly, the next time any problem came up in the colony, James Otis was right back at Thomas Hutchinson's throat. And it confused him a lot. It confused Francis Bernard, too. So, but if you do look at the basic arguments between the two in the private letters, they're basically very similar.
Very.
Yep.
And Thomas Hutchinson, you said he had a daughter and a son. Did he have any other children?
Oh, yes. He actually had 5 children. He had Thomas, Elijah, and he had Sarah, as well as William, or Billy, as he called him, and Margaret, as who he called Peggy, which was the same cute pet name that he gave his wife as well.
So did any of them come back to the United States, or did they all stay in England?
That is a very good question. I actually do know some descendants of the Hutchinson family here. So yes, there actually is still, they do actually keep their connections in America. Thomas Hutchinson, however, no. His descendants do, however, do get to come back here, but not him. But most of them do go to England with him. When he sails away, he sails actually with Billy and Peggy. And some of his other children were already in England vouching for him. So by that point, by the time he leaves, they were a little spread. But there is, his descendancy does end up coming back here to America.
Also, in that it's a Foster Hutchinson house.
Yes.
Where does the Foster come in?
So his father married into the Foster family. So his father, Thomas Hutchinson, married the daughter of a Foster, and the house was actually inherited from her father. So that's really where the Foster Hutchinson house name comes from. It originally was in the hands of the Fosters, but his father inherits it, and he actually inherits so much land that his father actually donated a building that would later become the Boston Latin School as well. So the Boston Latin School was donated by the Hutchinsons, or at least by Thomas Hutchinson's father. Yes?
How usual or unusual was it to appoint a governor who himself, or maybe even multi-generationally, like Hutchinson, had lived in the colony?
Well, it wasn't unheard of, but here in Massachusetts, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it wasn't common, it just wasn't usual. We do, our first appointed royal governor, William Phips, actually was from Maine. So he was kind of an interesting choice, and they chose him because, so they do choose these men with very specific reasons in mind when they choose someone from the colony. They chose William Phips because he had military experience, but also because the new charter of 1692, they knew it was going to be a bit controversial. They wanted that first governor to be someone from the colony to kind of soften the blow that the people couldn't choose their governors anymore. And so later when we have Thomas Hutchinson, he is chosen for specific reasons as well, because there was no doubt in the British ministry's mind that their next choice was going to be Thomas Hutchinson. He had been here serving so many years, and he seemed like the perfect choice to settle the differences. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. So it's not, I'd say, common or rare. But I also wouldn't say it's rare. It's just unusual, if that makes sense. Usually when a royal governor came here, they were coming here to better their position in England. Thomas Pownall, for example, as well as Francis Bernard, both came from about middling sort, and they were coming here to better their position. Thomas Pownall really just wanted to try to climb up the ladder and become an aristocrat. So that's why he came here. He originally got a position as the secretary to the new governor in New York, and that was his in into the colonies. But 6 days after he got here, the governor was found dead in his garden after a fit of melancholy. They believe a possible suicide. And Thomas Pownall was left completely penniless. He had no idea what to do. He could go back home to England penniless, or he could explore the colonies penniless. He chose exploring the colonies, and it turned out that that was a good decision for him because he learned how the different administrations in all the colonies worked. And it made him, again, it makes him that unique governor that's a man of the people, because he was the governor that came in and said, oh, wait a minute, the British government thinks the colonies and their governments work this way, but they really work this way. And he was the royal governor that was willing to stand up to that British ministry and say, that's not how it works, though. I understand what you want to do, but you can't do that here because it's not how it works. So Francis Bernard, when he comes here, he doesn't have the same, he doesn't have that same background. And so when he comes here, he just starts off right away as the governor of New Jersey, and he's used to a lot of tolerance there. That was a colony that saw a lot of different religious sects. Here in Massachusetts, though, we were very strictly trying to stay Congregationalist. And so when he went to Massachusetts, that also kind of fumbled with him a little bit, is that he went from a very tolerant colony to an intolerant colony as far as religious freedom went. And so there are differences in the reasons why you would choose a royal governor coming from England versus someone coming from America. But if they were coming from England, it was mostly in the hopes of bettering their situation back home in England. And that's actually why Thomas Pownall goes home to England so soon after he starts his governorship, is he felt he climbed the ladder as far as he could go. Massachusetts was considered the colony you went to when you got a promotion. And so he wanted to go back to England and continue climbing up the ladder there. He actually does die at a very old age. And he does die pretty much considering himself having achieved that goal of becoming aristocratic. But yes, so you do see the differences between why certain governors would be chosen and where they're coming from and why they're coming from there. Does that fully answer?
Yes.
Okay, yes.
So could Canada be considered a sort of parallel universe or experiment in that they have their own royal governors?
Yes, they
but
do
they're
too.
also being taxed about the same time. And so is some of this about personalities?
So
and Canada just happened to get some...
it's a little bit about history. So Canada actually became part of Great Britain during the French and Indian War. When the French and Indian War is over and they sign the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain gets everything east of the Mississippi River, and Spain actually gets everything west of it. So we lose France in North America, because also Great Britain does get Canada, and that actually ends up falling under the jurisdiction of another one of my royal governors that later comes in. I just don't discuss him here because he actually puts Massachusetts in martial law. That's later General Thomas Gage. But they're a little different just because they had always been under the French government. They had not actually been under British government before, so they didn't have that same expectation that the 13 original colonies had. The 13 original colonies had already set a precedent of what it was like to be under the British monarchy. And actually, England was considered the freest country in the world back then. It wasn't so much that England was really tyrannical, so to speak, as this was a new policy and this was a new thing that the colonists were afraid of. If they accepted it, it would set a precedent. And if they accepted that precedent, it would allow for England to step in and start taking more measures that they didn't like. So the 13 North American colonies, they're doing what they're doing because of that. They also helped fight the French and Indian War with Great Britain in the hopes of spreading west. But what happens is, after the French and Indian War, Great Britain, even though it gains all of this land to the west, towards the Mississippi River, it realizes that it can't allow its colonists to spread west the way they want to, because if they do, then they're going to start a new war, and that war is going to be with the Native Americans there. So they actually set a precedent called the Proclamation Line. They split its new territory in half and say, colonists, you cannot move past that line. So that upset the colonists. The taxes upset the colonists, especially since some of those taxes were going towards a standing army that was protecting that proclamation line, which hadn't been here before the French and Indian War. And so all of that combined upset the 13 North American colonies in a way that it wasn't really so upsetting to Canada, because Canada didn't have that same history that the 13 North American colonies had, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is on the side. Was the Hutchinson family tied to the Salem witch trials in some way?
So Thomas Hutchinson, actually, his niece was in the Mather family. And in fact, the Mathers were a friend of the Mather family were friends with the Hutchinsons. Thomas Hutchinson himself grew up reading books that were actually donated or gifted to him and his family from Cotton Mather himself. So Hutchinson himself did not necessarily, I mean, his family is a little past the Salem witch trials, but they did have a little bit of that effect, which is interesting because you do kind of consider the Salem witch trials to be so separated, being in the 1600s versus the 1700s, and you think of it being worlds apart, but they actually were very close. Thomas Hutchinson actually was only born 20 years after the Salem witch trials. So his family, I wouldn't say had a direct link, but they definitely would have still been affected by it, certainly, even in their time. During the Boston Massacre trial, John Adams actually makes a famous argument to help acquit the soldiers. And one of the arguments he makes is we don't want to embarrass ourselves the way we did at the Salem witch trials 80 years before, because it was a button that still was very upsetting to Massachusetts, that we had this very embarrassing past where while England and Europe had already gotten past witch trials, we had this massive hysteria here, and all of England and continental Europe was looking at us with like we had three heads. So it was very embarrassing to the colonists, and it is something in their minds. Even if they don't have a direct link, it still had an effect on them, enough that John Adams even mentions it during the Boston Massacre to kind of press those buttons to acquit the soldiers. Yeah. Good question. Do I see a question in the back?
Yeah, so you didn't mention the king much. So did the governors have a relationship with the king, or was the king not really involved until it got to be kind of a military situation?
They didn't necessarily have to have a direct relationship with the king. A lot of the time, there is something called patronage, and that's basically the idea of it's like networking in a career today, where you have connections within the British ministry and you pull strings within the British ministry to get you that position. So the royal governors did actually pull strings with patronage, but a lot of the time they were getting that patronage from lords and nobles in the British ministry, not necessarily directly from the king. And it was usually the British ministry choosing who would be governor next. There's actually a position in the British ministry called the Secretary of State for the Southern Department, and they're really the ones in charge of what's supposed to be going on in the colonies. So that position is the one that the royal governors would really be writing to when they're trying to defend their position or explain why they did something. And that's actually who Bernard and Hutchinson are writing to, is at the time that the soldiers are sent, it's Lord Hillsborough. And Lord Hillsborough actually, interestingly enough, he sent the soldiers to Boston based off of the panic letters from Bernard, but he didn't clear that with Parliament. So actually, even when Parliament heard that the soldiers had been sent to Boston, they were pretty upset about that too, because that seemed like a kind of off-the-chart decision made by one man that should have been discussed, and it had not been. So that's really more of the people you're going to see them interacting with. Massachusetts also had agents that they would vote on and they would send to England to work with the British ministry and that Secretary of State for the Southern Department. And they would write to those agents and tell the agents, can you hand my letter or my essay to the king to read? So they would maybe have an indirect relationship, not necessarily a direct relationship. Later, when we see General Howe here in Boston, though, he did have more of a direct relationship. And though he never got an official commission from the government as a royal governor, we do see him later in literature actually called a royal governor. He's really just more of the last British authority in charge here in Boston. But he did have more of a direct relationship with the king. He was in Parliament at the time he was asked to come here. He had actually even promised his constituency that he would never fight against the colonists because that was actually considered a very unpopular idea in Great Britain. But as his relative, even as a relative, when his King George III, asked him to go to the colonies and try to see what he couldn't do with the colonists, he couldn't say no. But it's why later in the actual American Revolution itself, because of that relationship, Howe had, even though he's here and he's doing it for the king, his heart isn't all in fighting with the colonists. And that's why we see a lot of him and his brother honestly just trying to give the colonists a slap on the wrist and then saying, okay, please, if you just come back, we'll give you a pardon, we promise. The colonists don't buy it. But he's really the one that I would say has more of that direct relationship with the king. But again, he doesn't get an official commission as the other royal governors did. Any other questions? No?
How about a round of applause?
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.